Hello, folks and friends. Welcome here. Today, I'm going to be talking about a question that was posed to me, and that is the question of whether or not we should be taking our families to the beach or going to the beach because of all the immodesty that is typically present at the beach. I thought this was a neat topic to talk about. I talked and fleshed it out with my husband a bit. And so here were some kinds of things that we came up with, some thoughts for you to ponder. And yeah, hopefully you can glean something good from it, give you some insight, and just give you, some more angles to maybe approach this topic from. I'm going to first start off with kind of just talking about what I think the underlying question is, talk about some kind of scenarios to ponder, as well as addressing some approaches that one could take about going to the beach that were presented to me and just my commentary on those. And then my own personal thoughts at the end, sharing about, how we kind of feel about the beach in general, or how would we go about, going to the beach. So ultimately, I think what this question is asking, more so than even the beach in and of itself, like whether it's okay to go to the beach, but asking the question, how much should one tolerate exposure to partial nudity to oneself and one's family? Because that's really what the underlying issue here is, the amount of immodesty that's being exposed at the beach, not necessarily the beach in and of itself. Therefore, hit at the deeper question. I think, first of all, the reality is the standard of modesty in our modern day is very low. And just looking out your window, stepping out of your house, going to the grocery store, and even mass, unfortunately, sometimes you just naturally tolerate some level of immodesty or overexposure to the body. But the question of the beach becomes just more of a consideration because there's way more exposure there and in excess, usually. The object of going to the beach, as in what you typically do at the beach, is recreational. It's leisure. It's not a necessity to go to the beach, whereas going to the grocery store or going to mass is. So again, digging into the question even further, the next maybe level or deeper question, therefore, is, does going to a beach go beyond what one should tolerate in terms of modesty and partial nudity? So first, just going into, like, why does it even matter? Maybe we don't even think that going to beach is a big deal at all, or it's not an issue. But as a Catholic and as parents, we have a responsibility to control and moderate our exposure to temptation, especially temptation of the flesh, because that is the most tantalizing, that is the most attractive, in a sense, temptation for man, as God has made us as beings with deep longing and desire. We have sexual desire placed within us. And so how we treat the human body, how we clothe ourselves, how we talk about modesty or don't talk about certain things within these topics or realms, are things that shape our children's view and our views on modesty, purity, custody of the eyes, and things like that. And in regards to lusting over another person, or not lusting, looking lustfully at another person and putting ourselves in an occasion of sin, that would be going along with keeping the sixth and ninth commandment. And so I'm going to now jump into, like, factors that go into one's discernment in whether or not one should go to the beach. And so the Catechism outlines a criteria for judging moral acts, whether an act is morally good or morally evil. And the criteria consists of these three things: the object, the intention, and the circumstance. The object here that we're talking about today is going to the beach. And now I'm going to outline the intentions and circumstances that could make going to the beach either a morally good thing, more or less of an evil act or an evil thing. If the object of an action is intrinsically evil, then it doesn't matter what the intention or circumstance is, it will always be evil. So an example of this would be abortion, which is murder. that is intrinsically evil. And therefore, there is no intention, no circumstance which changes abortion to be a good thing. Whereas now here we're talking about the beach. The beach is going to the beach in and of itself is not intrinsically evil. So there are intentions and circumstances that can change the nature of going to the beach. And I'm going to get into that now. Here are some specific factors that might play into one's discernment of going to the beach. And so to ask yourself maybe these kinds of questions. What kind of beach am I going to? Because there is a big spectrum of beaches. Like depending on which beach you go to, and usually depending on where it's located, usually changes the vibe or the atmosphere of the beach itself. So, like, the kind of beach that you find in Florida where people are, pulling out their tanning towels and their umbrellas, and there's usually a lot of people there. That usually has typically just more immodesty because it's closer to a city center and things like that, and it's heavily populated. Whereas if you go out into the sticks or into the boonies where there's quote unquote beaches there that are actually just really small bodies of water, there's usually not a lot of people around. Yeah, maybe there might be immodesty there, but the encounter is infrequent because of just how it's not very, popular. It's not a popular place to go to. And so, like even my husband would say that he went to the beach all the time growing up as a child, but his beach experience was a body of water that was right across the church, right across the church. They called it the church dock. And most of the time, the only people who were swimming there were families, large Catholic families who all lived in that area. And there weren't a lot of local people around or visiting people who would go there because, again, it's just wasn't a very populated place. So just that, even that in of itself to determine, okay, is this the best spot to go to? There are usually a lot of different options for beaches. Maybe it might take some digging, but that can change. Yeah, just like that can be a good thing to factor in when it comes to discerning whether you should go. The frequency of when you go. If you're invited to a family reunion and it's going to be at a more popular beach, well, it's, kind of more of just like a one-time dealio. You're not going to this place very often, but maybe just to be aware of what you're getting yourself into versus, this is something that you want to make part of your child's life, your family, like family activities that you do regularly in the summer. And so if you're going to be frequenting a beach and being aware of these kinds of factors, I think that should definitely play into what kind of beach you go into or which beach you go to. And then what are you doing at the beach? There are definitely a variety of activities that can be done at the beach depending on the kind of beach you go to. So, I mean, typically a lot of people who go to the beach are just relaxing, they're just chilling, just kind of having a good time. And it's typical, though, for larger beaches to have more activities, like more kind of like facilitated activities. So, for example, your family wants to go kayaking. They enjoy kayaking or sea doing or canoeing. And so, you have to kind of walk on the beach to go do the activity you're doing, but you're not primarily spending a lot of time in the main hub itself. You're mostly out in the water, kind of away from people. And even those things factoring in and of itself are those things that you're doing at the beach that kind of make it a little bit more like, it's not going to whatever beach you're going to isn't as big of a deal because that's not the primary focus, is just to sit there and watch the people in front of you. So therefore, in some ways, it doesn't really matter what beach you're going to because you're not even spending that much time on the beach in and of itself. So anyways, those are just like a few factors. Another factor might be, how old are your children? Obviously, we should be protecting our our very small children. I'm not saying that, but there is definitely a difference in terms of the awareness and the kind of awakening in one's the observancy and even just like the natural desire that kind of is awakened in adolescence and in teenagehood, for the desire of another or to be attracted to the opposite sex. And so there is a difference between like the awareness of taking, newborn to 2-year-old to your 3-year-old, your 4-year-old to the beach versus your 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old, in terms of just what they're aware. And not to say that, if you have young children, it shouldn't matter. It still should. They're very impressionable. They observe what's going on around you. But I'm just saying that I don't think I would say it's objectively true that um, the way it affects them and the way and what they're observing is not equally the same. But obviously still be aware of that. So anyways, those are some factors to kind of maybe play into your just discernment of whether or not you should go to whatever beach you're thinking of. And then now I'm going to touch on a couple of approaches that I was given in regards to this topic. And here are just maybe my thoughts on that. So the first kind of stance would be to never go to the beach. One would say you should never go to the beach. It's morally wrong to go to the beach all the time. It would be an occasion of sin because you fear that your children will look lustfully at other people or think that the way that people are dressing there is acceptable. And I think, honestly, I think that's just a really fair qualm. I think that somebody has. And in the spectrum of purity in particular, it's probably better to err on the side of caution than to be kind of like lax and flippant about it or dismissive about it. In Lorenzo Scupoli's Spiritual Combat, he talks about growing in greater virtue, and how to grow in greater virtue when it comes to certain vices is to reintroduce yourself to it. So, for example, if you really struggle with being patient, he encourages and says to, kind of embrace constant instances of being of impatience so that you can grow in patience. However, so that you can grow in patience, not impatience. um, but however, when it comes to sins of the flesh, you flee. Like you don't try to reintroduce yourself to it to become stronger. Like if you are dealing with a pornography addiction, you don't reintroduce pornography to yourself in order to eradicate that vice and that sin from your life. You just completely eradicate it from your life. And so, in that regard, I do think when it comes to sins of the flesh or temptations of the flesh, yeah, definitely erring on the side of caution, being very aware, being very cautious and intentional about what we're exposing our families and our children to. I think that is good. I think that in and of itself is a good thing. And then even in the Catechism, paragraph 2342, it says, self-mastery is a long and exacting work. One can never consider it acquired once and for all. It presupposes renewed effort at all stages of life. The effort required can be more intense in certain periods, such as when the personality is being formed during childhood and adolescence. And so even there's like that acknowledgement in the Catechism that in particular as a child and as a teenager, that these are kind of like very particular sensitive stages that we should be aware of. However, I do think that, if you believe that sheltering or avoiding these environments at all cost is an efficient enough effort to teach your child how to rightly order their passions and to, have a good conscience and, form their appetites properly, I think that would be naive to believe. And I think this sort of approach is taken to a lot of things, like just X-naying something or kiboshing a certain thing that, can be a temptation or misused. You just kibosh that thing completely. For example, screens, alcohol, video games, certain luxuries, sugar, junk food, other people or children that, they aren't like evil or wretched or anything like that, but you just don't like the way they do things, or you fear the kind of influence they'll have on you or on your kids. And so you think that the best way to go about handling that is just to avoid those kinds of people at all costs. I do think, especially as parents, like who are, I think the intentions, obviously, we're trying to do good. We want to raise our kids well. Um, we want to raise our kids well. We want to raise our kids in virtue. But I think there is this belief that if you just completely eradicate something from your life or your child's life, that it'll teach them to have a healthy relationship with that thing. But I don't know about you, but like, how often do you see that that's just not the case? like young people usually who aren't allowed, an ounce of alcohol or sugar or screens, like go nuts when they're out of the house and aren't controlled or aren't under the supervision of their parents. And so, if you never give your child the opportunity to choose the good, they will most likely struggle choosing it when they're independent or faced with, negative or positive influences. They might succumb to the negative ones because they haven't had enough exposure to kind of like try and test them and refine them to do good or to follow the good thing. And I don't think that serves our children. I don't think just not allowing them to kind of experience the struggle or be challenged in any, shape or form is going to create in them a well-formed conscience, which is the objective of our formation for our children. Okay, the next scenario is to just, like you don't think about it at all. So you have zero qualms, about the environment. And within this scenario, I was posed this part where, one even says that they think it's actually a good thing to expose their family to these kinds of environments. And that there's even a pointing out of immodesty and explaining to our children what's appropriate and or that's not appropriate or something like that. And I don't necessarily think that's the answer either. If your family were to be invited to a concert and the main event of that concert was going to be half naked men and women, like kind of prancing around stage, would you go? Because again, depending on the beach, that kind of is the vibe. That is kind of what is present there. And I don't think having, zero discernment or intentionality is the answer. And just to the point of pointing out immodesty to our children, like I think that's a nice sentiment. But with the amount of like the volume of immodesty that is typically present at a beach, I doubt it's very realistic to kind of like moderate that and to point out every single instance and talk about it. Also, like the point of going to the beach is supposed to be, in a sense, like a fun, relaxing thing. And if you're on guard the whole time trying to make this into a teaching experience, I feel like there might be just a better activity that you should be doing instead. But it also just doesn't seem like a sustainable model to form your child. Like, are you going to be doing that for the next decade? And I just think in general, like there are better forms of teaching your child purity of heart and mind and of the eyes than, to take them to a beach where there might be a lot of promiscuity around. Anyways, moving on. So the last little bit here is just my personal thoughts and our approach to going to the beach. My husband and I are, in general, just people who are not about having hard and fast rules about things that aren't intrinsically evil. And so, because of the nature of going to the beach is not intrinsically evil, there are circumstances where I think, yeah, we would be fine with going to the beach. It's not necessarily like, we're not completely anti beach and we're not going to kind of ex every single beach that exists because of the potency to encounter immodesty. So, yeah, it would just be kind of like a discernment and an intentional thing per per instance. However, I will say going to the beach is not our first choice of recreation or leisure for our family. For me, honestly, and personally, I have issues with going to the beach because of my own personal past. There's things that I've struggled with in my past that I've repented for. But I know that to be a place that's a wound and an area that I need to kind of protect and safeguard because of my past. And so I personally don't like going to the beach because I don't find it enjoyable. I just personally don't find that enjoyable. I find it distracting. I find it hard. And if I'm especially on guard, it definitely defeats the purpose of relaxing. But also, it's not just I'm not just weary about going to the beach for my family in terms of my children. Obviously, they are a huge factor and part of the discernment. But like even if my husband and myself were by ourselves and we were like, "Oh, want to do something fun?" Probably going to the beach wouldn't be my first choice either because I just think of like Matthew 5:28, right? Everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And that goes for women too. Like women who look at men lustfully commit adultery under her. And I'm not insecure, I suppose, of my husband's, my husband looking has a wandering eye or anything like that. I mean, obviously we all have potential, like there's temptation, I don't expect him to I don't expect him to fall into sin, but I don't expect him to be blind neither and not notice the women who are around him, like, not very dressed. But I just don't really want to expose that to us as a couple. Like for me, the only person that I want to see shirtless is my husband. I think there should be kind of like there is a healthy, and it's within our vows and our covenant that our bodies belong to each other and each other alone. And so I suppose, we're jealous lovers. And so I don't want anybody looking at my husband. And I don't wear a bikini, so I'm not really, the consideration is like nobody's really looking at me. But yeah, I mean, we we own each other's bodies. Each other's bodies are ours and ours alone. And so I don't really want anybody like partaking in, that special into that sacred bond. And nor, in a sense, do I want to partake in anybody else's. Like, I just don't want to see that. I don't want my husband to be around that either. And so even for ourselves, I just don't think that's like the best environment for us to be in. And so we wouldn't necessarily gravitate to going to those environments or to those places. And then to close, just like this final last thought before we close up here. I do think that depending on your personal standard of modesty, it can greatly dictate how much of a distraction going to the beach is for you personally, and even, how comfortable you feel like taking your family to an environment such as that. Like if you yourself wear a bikini or wear tank tops or, super short shorts or things like that, like naturally the environment is probably not going to be that stark to you. However, for someone like me who has, yeah, like kind of stricter standards for modesty, the difference of going to that kind of environment is very stark for me and therefore very distracting. And so I think this is another topic for another time, but maybe just a little nugget of reflection as I'm closing up here. But if you see more in common with the majority of how people dress or what they wear at the beach, if you find yourself more aligned with that way of dress, I would even consider taking a look at your own standards of modesty, because I do think as a Catholic, we should have high standards for modesty, as well as we should feel different and stand out. And there should be a difference between us and the way we look and the way we dress versus a secular or unbelieving person. So anyways, that's all good for thought. If you were planning on going to the beach tomorrow, maybe you'll have more thoughts or things or topics of discussion on your car ride home or something like that. Again, I hope this was just mostly just to answer and to give my thoughts on the topic that was proposed to me. I think it's a good thing to talk about. It's a good ongoing conversation to have and to be intentional about, modesty, going to the beach, kind of exposure to just different things. Yeah, it's all part of pursuing the good intentional life we're called to, and I hope this gave you some good nuggets. Anyways, thanks for joining me this week. I'll see you next time. God bless.